7-year-old kid who's getting chippy with the other team during coach pitch baseball, and I handled it great on the field. And then I get in the car after the game, and now the emotions start to spike. And now that internal voice is like, they're going to learn today, right? Daddy's going to get loud, daddy's going to get angry, and we're going to get this point across. And I'm looking in the rearview mirror, and I see my 7-year-old son and my 5-year-old son sitting next to him, and tears are welling up in their eyes. And I'm just like, is this really what it's about? Not every kid wants to be a professional. Not every kid wants to be a college player. And I think that's the hardest thing for parents to keep in perspective, and for coaches, even within these organizations that are putting pressure on players or putting pressure on parents to do all this extra stuff. And it's like, for what? Like, at the end of the day, if our kid gets a scholarship and it saves us some money, that's awesome. But God dang it, that's a lot of pressure to put on a 13 or 14-year-old kid to say, well, if you don't make it to the next level, then this is all a big waste. Yeah, I had a parent that was talking about me being too fat and I was going to eat myself out of baseball as a 10-year-old kid, right? And that's, number one, what kind of insecurities are coming up for that mom in that moment? Her son and I played the same position. I had a great respect for him as a teammate. And she could have said it jokingly. She could have said it in passing with somebody. But again, like, where in the world is that appropriate for us as adults to start putting that type of thing out into the energy field of youth sports?
For the first time in 32 years, the Toronto Blue Jays are back in the World Series. And for the first time in the history of this podcast, we are speaking to a former Toronto Blue Jay in the form of Travis Snider. Hey there, I'm Scott Rintoul, and this is Better Sports Parents, a podcast aimed at exactly that, creating better sports parents, one day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year at a time. And ultimately, if we can do that, if we can all get a little bit better, we'll provide a better youth sporting environment for our children and have more children enjoying sport for a longer period of time and hopefully well into their adulthood. On paper, Travis Snider seemed to have it all. From the age of 9, he was the best baseball player in the state of Washington, and he wore that label well. Everything came seemingly easy to him, no matter which sport he participated in. And ultimately, he focused his pursuits on Major League Baseball. They came to fruition when he was drafted 14th overall in 2006 by the Toronto Blue Jays. And just 2 years later, at the age of 20, he was the youngest position player in all of Major League Baseball. But behind all of that on-field success, Travis Snider was hiding a number of things. And ultimately, they would result in what was an identity crisis. He wasn't able to separate his achievements from the person he was, and he didn't know how to find self-worth anywhere else. So despite it looking great from the outside, it wasn't great on the inside. Fortunately, Travis has put in the work, and he's poured his time and his energy into creating a better youth sports environment through 3A Athletics, a company that he is the CEO of. He's also a father of 3, he's a husband, and he is a work in progress like the rest of us. But he has plenty to share, and he'll do so right here as he steps into the batter's box on Better Sports Parents. First of all, Travis, thank you very much for doing this. How are you?
I'm doing well. Like we talked about before, excited for the Jays, sad for the Mariners, but excited for baseball. What a great series, and looking forward to a great World Series.
No question about it. Let's talk about what you're doing now as opposed to what you did back then, as I described in the intro. Once your career in baseball finished and you weren't playing baseball for a living, what made you want to enter the world of youth sports?
Well, being a father first, understanding, and even in my marriage at the end of my career, there were some deeper issues that I had avoided, and baseball was kind of that safety blanket of, we'll focus on baseball and address those things maybe down the road. And as I started to come to the realization that my playing career was over, had 3 young kids, and re-entering the space of youth sports, it became very apparent to me how far the pendulum had swung in terms of what was prioritized and the level of pressure the kids are under at such young ages. And as I experienced, very publicly in my career with the Blue Jays and talked about, at other organizations and other stops along the way, people don't understand how fragile the identity formation is, especially in these younger years of youth sports, and how that leads to long term positives and, in this case, many negatives, right? In terms of how we view ourselves outside of being the baseball player or whatever sport it is that we play. So, as I'm re-entering the space with three young kids, I wanted to be very mindful of number one, what baggage am I bringing into this, right? Number two, how can I use my own experiences talking about mental health, my own personal struggles, and be able to correlate these things to what youth sports brings in terms of experiences and learning opportunities. And I think what I realized pretty quickly being involved in the youth baseball space right out of playing was how much parents were driven by the idea of rankings and how good their kid was or how many games their team won versus what I feel like are the fundamental life skills that youth sports is going to bring us. Yeah, wins and accomplishments are great, but if that's what our main focus is, if that's what we're building our kids up on, that fall from grace that I experienced on a national and international level, right, playing for the Blue Jays, is a very difficult journey for kids to go through, especially if they haven't been given the opportunity to develop emotionally, to be able to handle these things and develop grit by going through tough situations, but having the right support alongside them along the way.
For those who do not know your professional baseball journey and where you're at right now, it's not that long ago. You just stopped playing less than a half decade ago. You're 37 years old. When you did finish playing at the age of 33, what was it, Travis, or maybe it was before that, that made you realize you were having an identity crisis, if we want to call it that, relative to who you were as opposed to what you do?
Yeah, I use the term identity crisis because I think even if you're not a professional athlete, you reach a point in your life, whether it's in your 30s or your 40s, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, where you realize the things that motivated you aren't really your core values. They're not really what make you who you are. And in the context of sports, stats are the easiest thing to point at. Being a 14th overall first round draft pick, I have all these achievements that I've stacked up on a very impressive youth and professional resume, but that's what my identity was. That's where I looked for self-worth, and the attention that I got being a big prospect and being a first round pick only amplified this experience of starting to tie my self-worth to external things such as these, reporters that are asking me 20 questions after every game, or Baseball America, or whatever publication that's touting me as the next great hitter or whatever it was, not being able to differentiate who I was from what I did. And that's a big focus for us as a company in terms of education, is helping parents and coaches and players understand how we form this identity through our youth sports experiences and how fragile that identity can be if it is tied to these external accomplishments, which again, I got a laundry list of them. But at the end of the day, at the end of my career, I was chasing the validation of getting back to the major leagues to make this whole experience whole. And what I had to come to grips with and struggle with and really start to embrace is those struggles really prepared me to transition from being a baseball player into being a husband, into being a father, into being a coach, into being a leader in the community. And really, what motivated me to start this company was to help bring some light to the darkness of youth sports. And I think it's overlooked because we celebrate the success stories of kids who go on to play at the next level in whatever sport it is, but we don't realize how many kids get lost along the way and what that means in terms of mental health and emotional development as they transition into being an adult and getting a job in the real world.
Is it fair to say that while on the surface it looked like you had followed the path in a pristine fashion, that you were one of those who was lost along the way?
Absolutely. I think I did a really good job of convincing people around me that I had it figured out. At the end of my career, first year or two out, heavily involved working with my now partner, Seth Taylor, who's a therapeutic life coach, as well as a marriage counselor. And coming to the realization, I experienced a lot of things in my personal life away from the field, was diagnosed with complex PTSD, been studying what codependency is and how the dynamic of parent-child relationship really impacts, personality and emotional regulation as adults, and just really started to see the correlation, right, between my struggles um, personally off the field, along with my successes and struggles on the field, and how all those things kind of come together to create a very complex system, not to use the complex PTSD term again, but like I realized I'm not like most people, not because I played in the major leagues, and not that there aren't a million other people out there who have experienced worse traumas and things in their lives, but it makes it very difficult, right? When you don't understand kind of your own framework and what makes you the way you are. My goal is not to be a victim or create more victim mentalities out there. It's really to help ourselves lean into the process of self-development and being a lifelong learner and understanding I'm not going to ever have it all figured out, but I'm going to continue to grind and continue to work in marriage counseling to become a better husband, to continue to work in this space that I do now with EMDR to heal some of these past experiences that show up, right, subconsciously when something small happens and it becomes a very big issue. And I think throughout my career, I was highly touted as a plus plus makeup guy. I have a scouting report from one of the scouts in high school I was close with, and I was an 80-80, right? 80 out of 80 in terms of makeup. And that's a big reason why, the Blue Jays selected me with the 14th overall pick and not having drafted a high school hitter is because I blew them away and every other scout that walked into my house with this level of maturity. But I really was wearing a mask, right? So parts of me had matured much earlier than should have in terms of child development, and then, parts of me hadn't. And those parts were really starting to show up when I struggled for the first time at the major league level and I got sent down for the first time at the major league level. And then trying to navigate from there as being labeled as a can't miss prospect or somebody who has unshakable confidence to feeling broken, but then having to put a mask on every day when you go to the field and convince the people around you that you got it figured out because at the end of the day, that the game has evolved at the major league level in terms of the support staff and resources that are available to players to lean into some of this stuff. But there's still a fine line that you walk when your employer is providing those services for you and ultimately making decisions about your financial future and your future in the game of baseball based off as much information as they can gather. So I realize it's a very complex dynamic to navigate at the highest levels. But we feel like, if we can really get this information in front of parents and coaches and leaders of organization in youth sports, we can start to combat some of these things that start to develop long term, that leads to players reaching a potential that's far lower, right, than their physical capabilities. And I think I've come to peace with the idea. I didn't play 10 years, hit 300, 400 career home runs and perennial Hall of Famer. I had to make peace with that. Even though in my heart, I believe I was capable of so much more on the field, I'm at peace understanding that this process was really to help make me grow as a person outside of just being a baseball player.
I want to commend you and thank you for sharing your personal story and for putting in the work, Travis. That's what this podcast is built on. That's why I called it Better Sports Parents, because none of us are finished products and we all should be working toward being better the same way that we have expectations for our own children to work each practice, each season, each year to be better at whatever they choose to do. You said that you were really good at putting on masks and hiding things. I think a lot of people out there can relate to that in their own professional careers. What were you trying to hide now that you've done the work?
There's deeper parts, right? When I grew up with two parents who were loving parents and supported me in my sports journey and created a community of parents and teams that had a lot of success on the field, but also built really strong bonds off the field. And as they started to really struggle in their marriage and battling with addiction, my house became very unstable, right? Like I was evicted from my house when we were sophomore in high school. My mom was in a coma for 2 weeks my freshman year of high school. So there was a lot of instability, right? Outside of just the ramifications of living with somebody who is an addict. There was a lot of these things that were starting to build up underneath the surface as to, what my childhood is not a normal childhood. And what is a normal childhood, right? Everybody has different experiences. But again, we start to realize even if your parent wasn't an addict, right, there are different things from a personality standpoint that impact the way that you develop as a child and into adult life. And so for me, when I got to that point in my career where 9, 10, 11, 12, you're starting to gain this recognition of being the best player in the state and winning state championships, and then go on to lead that same group of kids who played Little League Baseball all the way through high school, to an undefeated season and a 4A state championship, and then be the first round draft pick. You start to play the public image game, right? Where you have to convince scouts and you have to convince organizations that you do have these things all figured out, or at least to the extent that they haven't seen from an 18-year-old kid. Meanwhile, there's all these insecurities that are brewing underneath the surface of, well, my family, dynamic is not normal compared to the rest of the kids in my community. Sure, there were other kids that were going through similar things, but trying to keep these things kind of under the surface and just focus on what is the next thing I need to do? What's the next step in this process of becoming a Major League Baseball player, which was my ultimate goal that I achieved, but not realizing how I was hiding those parts of me, right, that really were struggling with the idea of the instability and the uncertainty, which is normal human emotions and experiences, but amplified right by these childhood experiences. And really not even having the awareness. And I think that's been one of the biggest realizations for me. And continues to be every therapy session that I do is like, man, there are just things that we bury underneath the surface that we don't even realize, right? We're carrying in our subconscious mind that dictate the way that we respond in situations. It dictates the way we make decisions. And there's ways to leverage that system. And that's where I feel like, the mental skills work that I did throughout my career, equipped me in a lot of ways to kind of put really strong band-aids on some of these issues. But when it came to, going back to Major League camp in 2021, after basically being out of baseball in 2018 and kind of fighting my way back in 2019 with the Reno Aces AAA for the Diamondbacks, and I went to Major League camp in 2021. And I'd played 14, 15 years at this point, and sorry, this is 2020. And I go into camp that year in 2020, and I'm shook, right? This is my fifth 13th or 14th Major League camp, and I felt like an absolute rookie because now I'm getting to this point where imposter syndrome, am I really this guy? This conviction that I had in 2019 is no longer there. So just having the constant realization throughout my journey that as soon as I felt like I had things figured out, it felt like they pulled the rug out from under me. And a lot of that energy was wasted on blaming coaches or blaming organizations when really it was internal work that I needed to lean into and realize how that shows up in parenting, realize how that shows up in how I parent how I interact with my wife, and all these things, right? There are areas that I need to continue to grow and improve on.
It's an excellent point, and I believe every single parent out there watching or listening to this will relate to that because you go into marriage, you go into parenting with this idea of how you're going to behave and these things that you're not going to do that you either saw your parents do or have seen other people do. And then in tense moments, you react in a certain way because it's built into you. And there's a shame associated with that. There's a guilt associated with that. Have you gone through that in your own journey through marriage and fatherhood?
Absolutely. I mean, if my wife was in here, she'd be the first to tell you there's a lot of things I still need to work on, right? And that's as challenging as that is. It's something I got to continue to lean into and be open minded to evolving my approach. That connection that we have, from a parenting standpoint. My kids carry a different label, right? Their dad played in the major leagues, so there's a whole nother label that they have to carry with them that I never had to carry. But going into this experience of being a parent, like you said, we have ideas of how we're not going to allow our kids to do things, but my kid will never do this, or I'm never going to be that parent, right? And then there's things that we don't even realize that are in our subconscious, like you said, that are hardwired into a reaction. And that's where, the most obvious example is the car ride home, which is a big thing we preach in this space, is how important it is for us to understand as parents is that is not the time to coach our kids. Even if we have the greatest advice that we can give our kids, or even if we want to teach them a very valuable lesson about sportsmanship, which was my biggest mistake. A 7-year-old kid who's getting chippy with the other team during coach pitch baseball, and I handled it great on the field. And then I get in the car after the game, and now the emotions start to spike. And now that internal voice is like, they're gonna learn today, right? Daddy's gonna get loud, Daddy's gonna get angry, and we're gonna get this point across. And I'm looking in the rearview mirror, and I see my 7-year-old son and my 5-year-old son sitting next to him, and tears are welling up in their eyes. And I'm just like, is this really what it's about? Do I feel better now that I got angry at my kid for not managing his emotions when I'm clearly showing that I'm unable to manage my emotions in this moment? And again, I don't want to tell parents that you can't be firm and you can't have these kind of come to conversations with your children, but man, that was a punch in the gut just to realize, even at the time I'd started this company, right? And felt kind of this pressure to be a perfect parent. That's not what it's about. It's about being able to understand we're going to make mistakes, but if we can learn how to repair those mistakes And we can continue to educate ourselves and saying we don't know everything, right? I don't know everything. Seth doesn't know everything, but we're trying to pick out as many of these low hanging fruit opportunities, along with a lot deeper concepts that we can dive into with parenting to understand how much of this is dictated from our subconscious, how much of this needs to be brought to the surface and addressed and worked through so that we are prepared for those incredibly important moments to connect with our kids right before we try and teach them, before we try and coach them. Because everybody's been, yelled at when you're emotionally just at the end of your rope or you're overstimulated, right? Imagine a 7-year-old kid who's been shoved in this box for 90 to 120 minutes to play a game. And then as soon as you get in the car, boom, now you're getting hit with the feedback. It's like, would you want somebody sitting by your computer at your desk as soon as you finish your grind session at work to be like, well, if you would have just done this, this, and this, and this, it would have been so much better. And nobody's going to react, positively in that moment. So that was a big realization for me and will continue to be, the internal experience that I have to be aware of and I have to be able to work through in those moments because emotions are still going to come, right? But how we approach the conversation, when we approach those conversations is so important.
You're absolutely right. And car coaching is one of those situations I think everyone wants to avoid. Yes, there are going to be times where your child brings up a situation in the car and they literally ask you for your opinion. And you don't have to avoid it in that situation. But I also think it can work in reverse. Like you said, you handled it very well on the field and then it all came out in the car. I've had the opposite situation with my oldest daughter, and she's excellent at masking those emotions when she's in that sporting environment. And then the waterfalls and the emotion, it all comes out in the car. And what's been difficult for me, and I'm not sure if you can relate to this or not, is that I had to learn, and I'm still learning, that I just need to listen at that time. I don't need to fix anything. That's not what she's asking for at that time. Have you had that?
I mean, you could say that about marriage. You could say that about parenting, right? It's do you want me to fix it or do you want me to just listen? And I think if we can always default to the listening and holding the space, and that gets thrown out in gentle parenting as a term that triggers people, but holding space is really just giving your child, right? In this case, your daughter or my son, the opportunity to try and process those emotions, whether they did a great job on the field of masking them like your daughter did, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, my 7-year-old who's just, getting after it with every kid on the other team. At the end of the day, they need to feel safe, right? They need to feel like they have a space to process these emotions. That doesn't mean that there can't be lessons taught and lessons learned, but that's not the time to do it. And I loved how you brought up the dynamic of when a kid asked you for your opinion. My son, because we've created this dynamic now where I'm very careful about what I say, and now he's very interested to hear what daddy has to say, right? So a couple of tips I would give for parents in that moment. Number one, can you turn it around and ask them what they think, right? Because it's easy for us to give our feedback, but at the end of the day, if it's always an external cue, right, our kids aren't developing that internal or intrinsic motivation and understanding of what they need to get better at. So I always try and turn the question back onto my son. What do you think you could have done better today? Because he'll ask me, Dad, what do you think I could have done better? The other thing that we do, right now with football season is we get in the car. I'm very careful about what I say. I just check in on his emotions. You good? Yep. Okay. If he wants to talk about it, I'll let him lead the conversation, try and turn it back on him. And then we get home, right? And he's eating a little bit of a dinner before we go to bed. And we've kind of created this routine where he's like, Dad, sit down. I want to talk. I'm like, what do you want to talk about, bud? He's like, wow, I want to hear your thoughts on practice today. I say, okay, well, again, turn it back on them, pick and choose, once in a while when I feel strongly about something, I feel like I can approach it, from a emotionally safe place with my son. So I'm not getting that spike in emotion and getting upset with him. But there's not one way to do this, right? We all have kids that have different personalities, respond differently, right, to criticism or coaching. But I always encourage parents to be very mindful. The car ride you got to create a safe space to build that trust and build that connection for your son or daughter to then want to open up and share these feelings with you, and then not to feel like you have to fix it, right? But encourage them to work through that and develop that emotional regulation on their own without mom and dad, right? As it becomes more age appropriate for them to have their own internal process that they're working through.
That's another point that bears repeating, and it's been said on this podcast before and will continue to be said, is that not everything is going to work for every family and every parent and child dynamic, but these are best advice type of approaches, and you have to try things on for size. Trial and error is the only way we learn. Now that you've done the work and you look back at your own childhood, how would you describe, Travis, your parents' approach to your youth sports?
Man, I had such unbelievable core memories. Dad played softball, grew up at the field, glove bigger than me in the outfield playing catch. In Mariners we talked about earlier. I grew up in the '90s. Griffey, A Rod, Randy Johnson, Jay Buhner. I loved baseball. I loved football. I loved basketball. As long as I could remember, I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. My parents did a really good job of number one, my dad went to work early so he could be home in the afternoons more often than not, whether that was for me to drag him outside and play catch or go play basketball or whatever. He was a present father for that, along with, the unstructured play, which I think I want to hit on real quick. Because the world of youth sports has become so organized, and because we are putting our kids in sports so much younger, and because, culturally, it's less likely that your kids are going to the park multiple times a week to just play sports with their buddies away from the structured youth sports environment. We're really losing these opportunities for kids to have that unstructured play that they are designed for, right? From 0 to 10, 0 to 12. So we have to recognize that in those moments, when there is structure, when there is organized sports, what is that actually doing to our kids, right? And to be able to kind of pull back and say, how can we create, opportunities, whether it's having a big backyard or a park down the street or just trying to rally kids. And I think that's one of the things that my parents did such a good job on, was creating a community of parents that had kids that were same age, similar, mindset families. We spent a lot of time together in structured, but also unstructured sports experiences. Um, like I said, we had a lot of success in Little League, which kind of sped up this whole maturation process. And I think a lot of the parents, had never experienced that kind of success in youth sports. So it was a new learning experience for most people who were involved. But they did a really good job of keeping and building and keeping a community together. And even as their lives started to crumble, for lack of a better term, in terms of their own personal struggles, I'm so grateful to know that I had so many second moms and second dads through sports that cared enough about us as a family to rally when my mom is in a coma for 2 weeks or my parents are going through it. And you have these opportunities, right, through youth sports to impact your own child's experience. But I want every parent to just zoom out for a second and think about the kids within the team or within the organization that you could potentially mentor or support or show up for at some point when life gets tough, right? Because we're all going to have people in our lives that are going through things. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts that my parents gave me was their commitment to the community that built this support system for me to be able to experience things on and off the field and feel like I had a safety net, so to speak. And that was something, as I've realized in my own personal therapeutic journey, I didn't have that sense a lot within my relationship with my parents as things started to go sideways. So that leads to, right, certain behaviors and responses, on a bigger scale when you're getting sent down and you don't know when you're getting called up and all the uncertainty that baseball and sports can bring. That made it very challenging for my personality. But I'm grateful that my parents prioritized this idea of community and sports and built a really strong support system for me and gave me tons of opportunities to go out there and play baseball as an amateur player at the highest level.
There's a lot in that answer that I want to dig into. Let's start with the free play because you wanted to highlight that. There are a lot of parents out there who might say, well, when my child's at home, he or she doesn't just want to go to the park. That's not what he or she chooses. I would counter with, because I've been yard duty at my kid's school before, if you go to any lunch hour or recess, they're all out there playing. And it's because it's unstructured and it's because they're around other kids and they do things that you might not think that they're interested in. I'm wondering if you believe that there's an opportunity within organized sport, because as you mentioned, the time commitment is greater, the cost is greater. Kids are spending more time at the field or the gym or the ice rink. Do you believe within youth sports there's an opportunity for coaches and organizations to say, we're going to set aside time or even a full practice every single week to just let them go?
I would love to see that. I think different organization. I can only speak for the handful that I've been a part of. Right? They try and prioritize that at some portion of practice, but I think that's when you zoom out and you look at the 10,000-foot view of how things are much different. Yeah, it's never going to be the same as it was in the '80s or '90s when we were growing up. But at the end of the day, our kids are missing out on those opportunities to just play without that structure or without that pressure of a coach or a parent telling them that they're doing something wrong. So, I encourage parents of young kids, right? Before you want to, force or sign them up for t-ball or biddy, whatever sport it is that we're talking about, where are your opportunities to just go out and spend 10 to 20 uninterrupted, undistracted time with your kids and just let them lead the play experience, right? They could want to run the bases backwards. They could want to hit cross-handed. They could want to do whatever they want to do. But as long as we're creating a safe experience for our kids to where they feel like they can just play without the structure, that's really what they're going to feed off of. So I would love to see more organizations do that. I think, one of the challenges that parents, coaches, and organizations face is this feeling of falling behind or the fear of missing out. If your son or daughter is playing for an organization that's only practicing twice a week, and then this other organization, maybe a rival or a competitor, is practicing 3 times a week, now we're gravitating to the 3 times a week because we feel like we're getting more bang for our buck or more training for our kids. And it's like, guys, we got to slow down. When we're talking about 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, we're forcing them into this professional sports training experience and they're not designed for it, right? Doesn't mean they can't get better by going and participating in team activities or individualized instruction. I always encourage parents to look at the dynamic of that experience too, the environment. Are those kids having fun, right? Is it bringing them joy? They might not be the best player. They might not be getting, the most reps, but are they having a positive experience that's going to make them want to come back and do it again next year? Then as we get more into the 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old ages, it's like, okay, is this something that they want to pursue? And then how do we come alongside that? But not forcing all the structured training and practices on them at such a young age without, really realizing we've taken away a lot of these opportunities for them just to go and play. Like for me, it was pretending to be Ken Griffey Jr. or A-Rod or whoever it was in the backyard, playing with 3 or 4 or 5 of my buddies, playing wiffle ball, playing football in the side street, whatever cul-de-sac setup that we had. And I realized not every parent, right, or every kid has that opportunity, but the more we can find ways to give our kids those experiences versus just the structured practice and training experiences, I truly believe that is going to give our kids such a freedom that they don't get to experience now in the world of youth sports.
No question about it. I'm with you lockstep on that. And I know it's very difficult for people to break free of the structured environment we currently have right now. But it seems that there is so much more focus on skill development than development of enjoyment of the sport. You know, I know in the States there's the Institute that does a lot of research on youth sports. In Canada, Jumpstart is an organization that puts out the state of play. And it breaks my heart that in reading the most recent data from Jumpstart, that for the children who don't play organized sports, basically, the numbers break down to 1 in 10 kids that was surveyed feels they're not good enough to play. That was one of the answers they gave. I know 100% that's not true. Every child is good enough to play a sport. It doesn't have to be at the high performance level. How do we convince organizations? How do we convince parents that what we're trying to cultivate is fun and enjoyment instead of technical skill development and prowess?
From a personal standpoint, that's where I try and leverage my resume and my experience to say, I got to do this at the highest level. I got to be one of 700, people at the time who were playing at the highest level of baseball. I got to be a first round pick. I got to win all these championships. And yes, some of my greatest memories are from youth sports and playing on teams. But I think that's where going back to child development and the phases of child development and understanding that even if your kid's 14 or 15 and they don't want to go play college, whatever sport, right? Or professional, whatever sport, is it a great opportunity for them to have a league or have a team where they can go and still play a game that they enjoy playing without the pressure of feeling like they have to go to the next level? Otherwise, it's a waste of time and a waste of money and a waste of investment. Now, the caveat to all that, right, is parents invest time, money, energy into everything that we do for our kids. So we have to honor that part of this for parents, but we also have to put in perspective that not every kid wants to be a professional. Not every kid wants to be a college player. And when we start to kind of force that decision on kids at younger ages, that's what's leading to the burnout, right? My dad never had to tell me, my mom never had to tell me, you need to be a professional baseball player. That was me 100% through and through. Yeah, sure. Some of the things they did and some of the things that people in the community and coaches had a positive and or negative impact on that dream that I had, but at the end of the day it was my dream. And I think that's the hardest thing for parents to keep in perspective and for coaches even within these organizations that are putting pressure on players or putting pressure on parents to do all this extra stuff. And it's like, for what? Like, at the end of the day, if our kid gets a scholarship and it saves us some money, that's awesome, but god dang it, that's a lot of pressure to put on a 13 or 14-year-old kid to say, well, if you don't make it to the next level, then this is all a big waste. And I think that's the perspective we have to continue to lean into with parents, along with the one that you mentioned earlier, right? Is if we are going to ask our kids to invest this time and this energy into becoming better at a sport, what are we willing to do as parents? How are we, and this is kind of my favorite perspective, generationally speaking, I had an experience with my parents. There was some good and there was some bad, right? And let's just say for all intents and purposes, we'll use a football term. We're on the 20-yard line, right? How far can I move that ball forward to the end zone of giving my kids a chance to grow up with emotional intelligence, a solid, secure identity and who they are outside of what they do, and then build that as a foundation, and where it takes them, it's going to be a great journey to be on, whether that's college, professional, or they don't even play high school, right? Because I know that I'm giving them opportunities, not from a scholarship standpoint, but from an emotional intelligence and just child development standpoint, to be kids and then continue to learn these lessons as it's age appropriate. That sports are one of the greatest vehicles to teach these lessons to our kids, but we ask them to do all these things. Oftentimes they want to do it, oftentimes they don't. Are we willing to look in the mirror and say, what can I continue to do to grow and learn as a parent, so that eventually, if our kids grow up and have kids, right, they get to take the ball wherever we left it on that football field and continue to move it forward without the pressure that everybody's got to score a touchdown, right? Because everybody has different things in their lives and different dynamics. But how can we create a better environment for our children, which then has the generational impact for our grandkids and generations to come?
Yeah, it's really myopic to look at the financial investment in sports and believe that there needs to be this ROI on that investment from your child without seeming to do the math that if you just took that money and invested it in a savings account, that college would be paid for no problem over the years. But people seem to forget that aspect of it. When you look at your own upbringing and you look at your parents relative to pressure, did they put pressure on you either intentionally or unintentionally, Travis?
In my early years, I think the most important thing that my parents did, like I said before, was have a group of parents who were like minded and kids who were friends. And that's not always the case, but something I'm incredibly grateful for in my childhood. We had a set of dads who coached, most of the sports that we played all the way through, little league, and into the, kind of travel ball experience, which for me started at 13 years old. But having this opportunity to grow out of kind of the dad coaching experience and transition into having coaches who weren't just dads on the team. That transition, I think, for every parent is a difficult one. Finding the right organization, finding the right coaching staff that is going to help mold your son or daughter into a better human along with a better player. I think my parents did a really good job through Little League. I'll give my dad some credit. We did have our drama in the dugout, the father son drama, where I was a very big emotion kid, right? And that's another thing I'm learning. And I have one of my three kids who very much has a lot of daddy's anger and big emotions. And I recognize they didn't have access to the resources that we're trying to provide, right, as a business and what you're doing with your podcast, for parents to be able to start to think outside of the box in which we were raised in and what became a reality. So, as my dad and I had more drama in the dugout, he made the decision to shift from coach to league president, which got him out of the dugout, got that dynamic cleaned up. I don't have any vivid memories of my parents pressuring me to go put in the work. I don't have memories of my parents being just over the top in terms of blowing me up if I made a bad play or I struck out. I had a lot of success, right? So there wasn't that many opportunities for my parents to try and correct those mistakes. They did a good job of throughout my kind of teenage transitional years through puberty of trying to instill in me that the person you are is more important than the player you are. But then as I saw them struggle with their own personal challenges, this became very confusing for me as a young kid. It's like, well, you're not practicing what you preach, right? And that's one of the hardest things to do as parents. Say one thing, do another. We're all guilty of it in some form or fashion. So let's just get that on the table. And then as they really started to struggle health wise for my mom, battling alcohol addiction, needing a liver transplant, grandparents passed away. So there's a lot of these like very intense things that were taking place throughout my high school career where the pressure I felt to go out on the field wasn't that I had to perform to earn their love. It started to become like this pressure that I need to perform to be able to go and earn the contracts to be able to support my family, which I think we hear this story all the time from athletes of buying their parents their house or their car and financially supporting people in your life. And I think there's some good that comes from that, right? But it's also a lot of pressure. And I think that's one of the things that as I got deeper into high school and the realization that I was going to be a first round pick and kind of watching my parents really battle, those demons of trying to stay sober and trying to stay on a good path. It was confusing, but it also is something I give a lot of credit to them for through their struggles is I saw effort, right? I saw them say, I'm not perfect. I saw them say, I need to get help. I saw them go to rehab. I saw them go through AA, NA, GA, whatever it was. So there was at least an effort that was being made, right? And anybody who's been around addiction, they understand relapse is a part of the process. There is no perfect recovery. These are all things that I have been, exposed to and have experienced in my own personal journey, along with watching family and friends go through this. But the one thing I want to drive home for parents that are listening to this is we're trying to teach our kids how to cope, right? With failure. We're trying to teach them how to cope with life that's going to bring tough things. It's not always going to be rings and trophies and high rankings in state. And if we fail to use these opportunities that sports and life are going to bring to teach our kids what real grit is, right? It's not just rubbing dirt on it and getting back out there. It's like creating an actual internal process to heal, right, these things that are happening and go through the different emotions that being a human being is going to bring to you, but do that in a way where it's healthy and do that in a way where your coping mechanisms are not things that become self-sabotaging down the road. And I think that was one of my challenges being a young kid, having all this pressure and getting into the professional ranks and having all this success. It was like I was trying to numb this voice inside of me that was like, you're not good enough, or your family's not good enough, or whatever it is, right? These beliefs about self that are really deep concepts that you get into depending on what therapy you participate in. I think those are some of the layers that I've had to start to peel back as an adult and see, wow, these things really show up. Even though I don't realize it, they show up in these moments with my kids or my wife or business partners or people that I'm engaging with in the youth sports community, because we all have emotions, right? And I think that's where my parents tried to do the best that they could. They failed a lot, like every parent is going to. I've failed a lot. I'm going to fail a lot as a parent. But I want my kids to, like I said, have some things that I didn't have in my life, and be careful because we all overcompensate on some level to try and give our kids too much, right? Versus what is kind of a healthy traumatization, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at there. And it's very clear that you dealt with a lot of adversity in your life that wasn't related to sports. And the easy cliche thing here to say would be, oh, sports was an escape. And perhaps that was a part of it for you as well, Travis. I'm wondering, for someone who was labeled at the age of 9 as the best player in the state, and a label that would continue to follow you all the way up to being drafted 14th overall by the Toronto Blue Jays. Did you face any adversity in youth sports?
Yeah, so after about a year of therapy, I realized that I had 2 panic attacks down at the Western Regional Tournament in, the Little League. It used to be Western Regionals, and then you go to Williamsport. And we won the state championship that year when we were 11. I threw a no-hitter and hit 2 home runs in the state semifinal game. I mean, we're on top of the world. You know, big fish, small pond, whatever you want to call it. We go down and play against some teams down in San Bernardino, California, and on that stage, right in front of 5,000 6,000 people. This isn't Little League World Series level, but this was a big deal, right, for kids at this phase. And I threw a perfect inning, led off the game with a home run, and then went out in the second inning and couldn't throw a strike. And my emotions, right, just took over, started hyperventilating, started crying. It happened two separate times down there. And that was something, walking away, I remember having, some self-doubt for the first time, and really not sure how I was going to overcome it. But then it was just kind of like, we're just going to shove this thing down and get back after it. And then we took second when we were 12, and then transitioned into the summer ball experience. Our team had a lot of success, and I had a lot of success, so there wasn't a lot of other opportunities where I failed at that level, and didn't have the realization of how intense my emotions were. Every coach that ever coach would tell you, right, you're the most intense 15, 16, 17-year-old kid I've ever been around. And I think one of the challenges for me, right, as I work through this in my own personal, is like that intensity, that rigid part of me can do so many good things, right? But it also creates a lot of chaos, and it also, puts strain in relationships. It also, and trying to find this balance between, being a disruptor as a personality characteristic of mine, and using those strengths for good, right? Because it's easy to use those strengths for things that are not as good. And I think that's where not having a lot of failure prior to going to the major league level, struggled a little bit in Double A for a while. That was a bit of an experience. Me and Ricky Romero were sharing a couple of cold beers one night in Manchester, New Hampshire, and we're just like, "Is this it?" And then we kind of worked our way out of it. Both of us ended up going up and spending some good time together at the major league level, but a lot of that stuff never was really processed, right, in a healthy way. And I think that's where, when I did fail for the first time, it was kind of like, oh shit, the mask, excuse my language, but the mask has been ripped off now. You are not this perfect prospect, this, franchise player, all the different labels that were being put on me at this point, because I failed. And I was incapable at the time of being able to zoom out and be like, dude, this is totally normal. You're 21 years old. You're going back to AAA. Get healthy, get your swing right, come back here. The foundation should not be shaken at that point. It's a learning opportunity. But the way it was framed for me, Seth uses this terminology. It's like an elephant balancing on a pool cue, or a house that's built on stilts, right? This big, beautiful house, right? Got all these achievements and money made and all the things. What really just takes one good storm to come and blow that thing up, right? And then all of a sudden you're kind of left with the pieces. And that's what I felt like most of my career was trying to rummage through the pieces of what had been this big beautiful house, and trying to figure out if I could ever be that big beautiful house again, being the prospect, being the guy, right? And it was a really difficult journey for me and my ego, right, as I'm spending 3, 4, 5 years in the minor leagues at the end of my career without getting called up, and just like, what am I doing, right? If you would have told me at 20 years old I was going to play independent baseball in 2018, I would have told you you're crazy. But I went to independent baseball with the idea of, I need to get back into affiliated ball. And I realized this is kind of the cleansing that I needed to say, okay, do I love playing this game? Right. And some things happened at the time. My brother-in-law passed away from melanoma. So that was another big kind of hit to the family. But I saw how precious life was. And I realized, 34-year-old man who's, on his deathbed, with no strength and no ability to push forward with his dreams and what he wants to accomplish. So that really charged kind of the second wind of my career. But like I said, I had success in 19, was on a fringe call up guy, go to big league camp in 2020, and I'm just like overwhelmed. Having been in big league camp and being the veteran and being the first round pick and all the things, just didn't realize how that baggage stuck with me. And that kind of led into the process over the next couple of years of being like, I need to get help, right? I can't continue to convince people that I have all this figured out. I need to start utilizing different resources to process this stuff and gain a deeper understanding of what this is really all about.
Well, and I would consider you fortunate in the sense that you had that realization and you had the wherewithal to seek out the tools you needed to get that foundation under that house you described that wasn't there, because there are a lot of people, unfortunately, that go the other way and they do spiral into addiction or unhealthy behaviors. So I congratulate you and applaud you for doing that, Travis. When you look back, what did you need that would have built that foundation under that house that you are now trying to give your own children and those other children that you oversee as a coach or whatever capacity you're interacting with them?
Yeah, I think just the culture as a whole, prioritizing parent and coach education and leadership training within these organizations. And I'm grateful. I had, the leader of the summer ball organization I played with is a second dad to me. He's my closest, advisor, the guy I go to when I have troubles. And that's all a product of the youth sports experience. So there's a lot of good, right, that I got from youth sports. I think the idea of mental health and the conversations around mental health, I think Canada is much more open minded than the United States, at least in my limited experience in conversations. I think there's good progress on all fronts in terms of this conversation becoming more normalized and destigmatized because, again, we're talking about different generations, right, that are coming together on on a topic that, you know, the way you grew up is different than the way I grew up, and the way I grew up is much different than the way, you know, kids are growing up now. And I have conversations with, major league coaches, and just the consistent theme is, well, the kids aren't coachable. And it's like, why is that? Why are kids not coachable? Is it we need to adjust our perspective of how to coach kids? Is it we need parents and coaches at the youth level to do a better job of teaching kids how to regulate their emotions and understand when they're triggered, and have coaches need be more aware of if a kid is emotionally shut down and you're just trying to hammer down on some skill development piece with them instead of build a connection with them. I was very lucky to have coaches who cared deeply about me and went the extra mile on and off the field to make sure that I had what I needed. But I think as a whole, the more our parents and the more our coaches and the more our leaders in our community and our organizations are aware and open minded to continuing to further this discussion of how we support the development mentally and emotionally, along with the skill and player development that is 100% the priority right now, even though we have a bunch of organizations that say we're into this, and we got our culture code and we got all this, branding, which is what it is, right, marketing and branding about how we're a good culture in our organization, but we're not really actually willing to go out there and model the behavior and prioritize the things that are most important for our kids, with the understanding the ultimate goal shouldn't just be to produce Major League Baseball players or National Hockey League players. It should be to give kids this opportunity to grow and learn through sports. And when they show that they want it, then we can come alongside them, to the best of our ability to give them these opportunities to train and grow and learn at the highest level.
100%. And I heard it said in this past week, actually, by someone who's going into the BC Sports Hall of Fame. She said, I was given the gift of sport, and that's a gift that every child deserves for lifelong health. And it's that approach, long term development of a human being, not short term. Let's see how fast we can get somebody to this velocity, or how fast we can get their slap shot at this age. We're getting better athletes quicker, but they're burning out faster and they're never getting to their potential. And we're losing too many athletes and too many people in that process because we're so focused on the high performance pathway and we leave too much of it to the side. You said something about education, and I think it's a really important point. One of the big gaps I see right now is between coaches and parents, or organizations and parents. And we have to bridge that gap, because if we don't have those units working together, ultimately the children are the ones who are going to suffer. How do we better educate parents and coaches and get alignment in youth sports?
Yeah, so in year one of our partnerships, we focused on the parents and the players. And what we quickly realized, to your point, is when leadership, right, directors and board members are not aligned on what the core values are in the mission is of the organization. And this can be different from organization to organization. But in terms of communication and management of expectations, this has to be clearly defined from the top down. And that's where we realized in year one, we made the mistake, right, of not focusing more on the leadership team and then the coaches who are really dictating, right, what's being communicated, what are the expectations. Then you have parents who don't understand what they're signing up for. And there's always gonna be parents who know what they signed up for, but they're just gonna be, causing drama because they have their own unmet needs and things that are showing up in those moments. They're trying to protect their children, whatever the case may be. But we realize that a lot of these things are systemic, for lack of a better term, because these things are not being communicated clearly, and they're not even clearly defined at the top, right? And you might have, good culture code or whatever it is, but then you have just the the sense that everybody in the space is overwhelmed, right? I think any parent can say, "Man, I don't feel like there's enough hours in the day to focus on my job or my podcast or whatever it is our passion is, and then to show up and be a present parent." Like, it's a lot, man. It's a lot. But to your point, that's where we are trying to figure out, through podcasts like yours, through content like ours, how do we find these moments throughout the journey that we can lean into, the car ride home, coaching from the sidelines, um, you know, child development. What are these topics that we have to continue to evolve our messaging and approach so that people are interested and motivated and want to be engaged in it, right? Because we can create all the content we want, but if people aren't buying it, not from a monetary standpoint, but from an engagement standpoint, we're just, it becomes a term we use. It's mental masturbation, which is essentially what social media has really become, right? We cut these clips of the podcast and we like it and we share it with five friends and we feel like better about ourselves inside, but we really didn't actually do anything different, right? How many of those things actually resonates to show up in the moment when you need to regulate your emotions or approach parenting or sports differently? So that's one of our big goals, right? Is to continue to build content, continue to work with the leadership within these organizations, starting on a smaller scale here locally with big, national and international dreams and aspirations to get connected with these organizations, the governing bodies, the national governing bodies for these different sports and tournaments and big leagues, to be able to start to have these conversations from the top down. And then this become a priority, right? The same way it's a priority for our kids to get better at hockey or baseball or soccer or whatever sport it is, the mental emotional development and mental health of the kids has got to be the priority, 1A to 1B or number 1 to number 2 in my opinion. And so that's really what we're going to continue to bang the table for, for as long as we can do this, to build out the content that's going to be able to serve these organizations, from leadership training down to coach workshops and having content for coaches, and then the same thing with parents. And then yeah, we'll get to the kids. We have an athletes journal that I think goes deeper and touches on things you're not going to find in most athletes journal. But we recognize one thing too: the kids are already overwhelmed, right? We got them doing 50 sports and after school activities plus homework plus social life plus social media, and it's like, man, can we ask our kids to do any more, or should we take a step back and really focus on the parents, the coaches, the adults who are driving this bus? We use the term like buffalo heading towards the edge of a cliff. We see this a lot in youth sports where parents and coaches and organizations are just blinders on. We're moving forward. We're producing athletes, and we're not realizing how many of the kids, right, that don't get the spotlight because they don't go on to achieve these things, get lost and go down paths like you mentioned before, where I've seen, several of my friends and teammates from high school and other sports, in the worst case, commit suicide or battle, really bad addiction later in life because their entire identity was wrapped up in their performance on the field, and that's something we got to get away from.
No question about it. And it's ironic that we ask our kids to zoom out and we want them to take all of these great things from sports. And it's not about the one thing you did here, but we want you to take the bigger picture. And yet we don't often take that advice ourselves, or in many cases, we don't take that advice ourselves with our relationship to their youth sports, to zoom out and say, well, hold on, as a parent, there are certain things that I should demand and ask for from my organization. And as an organization, I should be supporting the coaches, whether they're volunteer coaches or paid coaches, so that every child has a good experience. And as coaches, well, how can I expect parents to understand what we're trying to do if I don't have an open communication channel and set those expectations from the beginning and have an ongoing relationship with those parents? If we don't realize that it's a circle and it's a symbiotic relationship instead of these silos where people just complain about the other and point fingers as to why it didn't work out for their particular kid, we're never getting anywhere, Travis.
Yeah, I was going to say too, one of the things that we're really trying to introduce and push, for lack of a better term, is organizations start thinking about creating a position we call the parent liaison. We could call the director of culture, but somebody whose main job and training should be in helping deliver content, whether it's your podcast, our content, all the great resources are out there for parents and coaches. Somebody whose main focus is to create that line of communication, because at the end of the day, we have to take some pressure off the coaches, right? Because the coaches deal with their job should be focused on developing the players, not just as skills, but as humans. But there's also a lot of parent drama, right? And there's a lot of things that they're dealing with from administrative side of things that we encourage these organizations to think about what it would be like to create a role within your organization that is the main point of contact for any parent things outside of logistics and what uniform we're wearing, so that we can offload some of this pressure from the coaches to have to be continuing to communicate with 10 parents on a roster why little Timmy's not playing and why little Susie is. But at the end of the day, that parent liaison becomes that buffer, right? And becomes the separation, but also the connection for coaches to be able to make sure that the information is getting out to parents, and that parents, when they do have questions or they have concerns, that there is a person that they can go to, and then it becomes more of a formal process of how this is being dealt with, so that those boundaries are there. And to your point, one of the things that we're including in our coach toolkit is scripts, right, for parent meetings, because that, from leadership to the coaches and coaches to the parents, that's where the communication has to be crystal clear and the expectations have to be crystal clear, and parents have to know where they can go when they have concerns and they have questions, but they have to honor, right, that commitment that everybody's making to build a healthy culture for the kids experience, to then be able to say, okay, I am upset about this. I'm going to reach out to the parent liaison. The parent liaison is going to facilitate either a meeting between them and me, or bring in the coach or bring in a director or whatever. But I mean, that's the other challenge, right? Is you got directors within these organizations who are handling a bunch of the administrative and teams and rosters and all these things. And then all of a sudden they're getting the parent stuff piled on them too. So I just, having close friends and being a part of organizations in the past that I think really had the right intentions, but you just see as things grow and evolve, how overwhelming it gets. And I think that's the term we keep coming back to: is how do we move people from overwhelmed to creating a little bit better structure and clarity within the communication and expectations, so that parent, if you don't like it, then go somewhere else, right? No hard feelings. We don't have to keep playing this game that we're going to sell you along to the idea that this is what it's going to be like. And then you get here and it's nothing like that.
No question. And the intentions you speak of, I do believe in 99% of the cases, whether it's parents or coaches, that they are good intentions. Oftentimes, people either don't have the education or just don't have the proper compass to direct them down the right pathway for that bigger picture of what we're trying to develop, which is independent, healthy people at the end of the day. I know one of your resources in the 10 principles that is offered at 3athletics.com is the impact of our words and the fact that we need to be impeccable with our words. Can you give examples of the impact that simply making a comment or talking to a child or a parent in a certain way can have?
Yeah, I think all of us want to be seen and we want to be heard, right? That's kind of basic psychology. We want to feel safe. We want to feel loved. Understanding where kids are at developmentally, psychologically, emotionally is a huge advantage to coaches to understand something as simple as the feedback sandwich, right? Like, hey, I saw you do this really well. Here's one thing I want you to focus on, but keep up the great effort, right? Now you're giving a kid some positive, here's some constructive feedback, and then here's another positive. And I'm sure there's people like, well, that's just soft. And it's like, well, no, we're actually ingraining a pattern into our kids so they feel safe to accept that feedback from it. And it could be a parent too, right? In the moments your kid asks you to coach them, always encourage that feedback sandwich. In terms of, being able to have a coach understand parent psychology, oftentimes they're also parents, right? So there's a dynamic between the dad or mom who coaches their child, the challenges that presents beyond just being a parent in the stands, right? Watching your kid. A couple of pieces I would say, you know, best advice I've heard is treat your kid like every other kid, which is the hardest thing as a coach to say. I'm not expecting more of you because you're the coach's kid. And I hear this a lot, like, you're the coach's kid. It's like, they don't need that extra pressure. They need to know that when you're on the field and the coach hat is on, that you are coach, right? And they need to know that when we get in the car after the game, the coach hat is off and I am mom or dad. But we have to have those boundaries. We have to have that communication with our kids, and we have to understand that's not going to be perfect, especially at the younger levels. There's going to be way more challenges with it. And then from a parenting standpoint, we have to understand not only what developmental phase our kids are in, what the expectations are for playing time, for positional, switching type of things. Because as you move further up, into the older developmental ages, there are competitive and there are rec, right? And I think we push this into the younger phases, which just creates a lot of competition that I just don't think is necessary or really healthy for kids at that stage. But as we get further up that pyramid, we'll call it, and if our kid is playing on a competitive team, whatever that means to you, let's use high school football as an example. Yeah, the goal is to still develop good human beings, and we should not put that stuff secondary to winning. But there's a shift, right, in what the priorities are, and that stuff has to be communicated. And I think, to your point earlier, when these things aren't clearly outlined and clearly defined and expectations aren't managed, that's where we're really losing parents or we're losing coaches, because that drama starts to feed off of each other instead of just saying, guys, this is what we're signing up for. If you're in, you're in. And if you're out, no hard feelings. Let's move on.
Yeah, there's a lot there. We had a previous guest, Andrea Neal, talk about this. She's a Canadian Sport Hall of Famer in soccer, and she talked about the difference between the objective of the game and the purpose of the sport. And those are two different things, as you just described. Yes, the objective of the game is for us to score more points, to win the game, but that's a very temporary environment. The purpose of what we're doing is much broader than that. And we have to be able to separate those two, because if we think everything is about the objective of the sport, this is where we're going to have these shallow experiences and not get what we hope our children get out of sport, which is these lifelong lessons that we're all geared towards getting them to. I also want to talk about the impact of the words on other children. We often think of it only about what we say to our own kids, but I know you told a story on another podcast and have been open about this before, that what you say about other kids in the stands or in passing to parents can have a very harsh impact on children as well, or a positive one if you frame it that way.
Yeah, so going back one step, the achievement-based identity is something that I talk a lot about and something that formed very young in me, and I see this forming in a lot of young kids, because the words we choose in those moments are to celebrate the result or the outcome. And I think going back to Coach Nick Saban, one of the greatest coaches of all time, like his biggest transition from just being a coach to being who he was going from transactional to transformational. And I think that's when we talk about the words and the impact from coaches and from parents. If it is transactional, we've all been in a relationship with somebody where it's transactional. It's not something that fills us up. It's not something that motivates us. Maybe it motivates us in some unhealthy ways, but at the end of the day, the words are so important that we choose to use from whatever role we're in. And then to your second point, yeah, I had a parent that was talking about me being too fat and I was going to eat myself out of baseball as a 10-year-old kid, right? And that's number one, what kind of insecurities are coming up for that mom in that moment? Her son and I played the same position. I had a great respect for him as a teammate. And she could have said it jokingly. She could have said it in passing with somebody. But again, like, where in the world is that appropriate for us as adults to start putting that type of thing out into the energy field of youth sports? So, but I get it, right? Because as a parent, we can be, very self-conscious. We can tie our identity to our kids' achievements on the field. That's something we all have to be mindful of. And again, it goes back to why we think it's important for parents and coaches to understand the psychological and emotional experience of being a parent and being a coach and combining those two things, because it's going to lead to some unhealthy behavior. Nobody is perfect, right? We are going to make mistakes. This isn't about having to be the perfect person, but it is about being willing to look in the mirror and say, what is coming up for me in that moment that I need to start talking, negatively about another 10-year-old on the team, without zooming out and saying he's a 10-year-old kid, right? It could be a kid who's got behavioral issues. It could be a kid who has ADHD. It could be a kid who has, all the different things that are out there in terms of, a diagnosis or a label that we want to put on somebody. But understanding they're kids, right? And where we're at at 10 is not necessarily where we're going to be at when we're 14. And we should always be looking for opportunities to build those kids up, because I am, that's one of the negatives of, to my point earlier, how many positive experiences and the amount of impact that other parents and other coaches had on me as my parents struggled through their stuff. And even if my parents were, more normal and less dysfunctional, just having that support system, man, like, just think about growing up in a world where you just feel like you got a lot of people who care about you and wanna see you succeed, not just in sports, but in life.
And it's a great way for us to wrap things up as we build toward a close here. You know, you mentioned earlier that you were a multi-sport athlete, and I'm sure you're a very firm believer in multi-sport, as most who made it to the highest level are. I certainly am as well. But ultimately, you chose to pursue baseball, which is a sport that has inherent failure built in. You're a great, great player. You'd be one of the best of all time if you could hit 4 out of every 10 times, which nobody actually does at the highest level. So failure is built in. You're going to fail more than you succeed. Were you properly educated on how to deal with failure outside of sport? Because, Travis, we think that all of the lessons translate into real life. But your example to me provides a very good one to say you might be able to do it in this compartment, but maybe not over here.
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. As a young kid, I figured out how to play the game, get good grades, stay out of relative trouble pre-social media. I don't know if I would make it in this world nowadays, but the kids have so much more of a microscope on them now that I think it's harder to get away with things, but it's also easier to lose sight of what kids are actually experiencing. And let's talk about social media for a second. Like, the pressure of likes, the pressure of followers, the pressure of that feeling of being connected and celebrated is something that we, I think, overlook, especially in youth sports, because we want our kids to have exposure. We want them to get recruited if that's what they want, right? Hopefully that's our motivation. But at the same time, how are we building this idea of success and failure? Because social media is great at showing, the vacations and the happy families and all the good, right? And not what's beneath the surface. So I think no matter what the context is, we have to look at every human, especially kids, but adults, parents, coaches, etc. There's what you see on the surface, and there's all the complexity that we bring into this with past experiences, emotions, etc. I had some really good mentors as coaches and people in the community who could pull me aside at times and be like, "Hey, man, you coming in here and destroying the dugout every time you get out is not a good look for you," right? And some of these messages landed. Um, Off the field, I felt like I stayed out of trouble enough, and there were a couple come to conversations that I had to have with my high school coach and some other people that were like, "Are you really willing to risk what you are working towards by making these choices?" Right? So presenting those things in ways where it was kind of like a hard truth that I had to accept, and I think that's one of the things that I've earned a lot of equity and credibility with people as I will make mistakes with the best of them, but I'm trying my best to just be accountable and teach my kids how to be accountable when they inevitably make those mistakes. So throughout that process, yes, I feel like I had some really good opportunities to learn from other people and learn how to deal with it. But at the same time, there was all these things that I was suppressing down, right? And trying to find outlets, through my early 20s, and just looking for love in the wrong places. It could be drinking, could be smoking weed, could be, going out into the bar scene. Again, we're 20, 21, 22 years old. Like, think about what we do in college. We lose those perspectives of like what high school kids' priorities are. And yeah, it's our job. And I think culture's shifting in a positive way for kids to be less into some of the things that maybe were in the 80s and 90s and early 70s, probably even too. But just bringing it back home, like, having the opportunity to teach kids on and off the field, right? How to be the best versions of themselves, not just as a sports player, but as a human being, challenging them in healthy ways to continue to lean into the things that they want to get better at. And then being able to have those tough conversations, right? When you have trust, when you have connection with somebody. And I think that's what we feel to realize as coaches and as parents is we can see it clear as day, right? What a 14 or a 15-year-old kid is doing that you're just like, why? But then you realize the brain's, at this point, like not just over halfway developed, three-quarters of the way developed. Impulse control is not there. So what we do and what we model is going to be much more impactful in building that connection to then be able to have those important conversations. So for me, I was lucky to have some people who could give me that tough love because I knew they cared about me. And there was also times where I wish my parents or I wish somebody would have just kind of grabbed me by the shirt, for lack of a better term, and be like, "What are you doing, man? Why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you setting yourself up for something down the road?" But again, we understand people have to experience things to really get the grasp and understanding of why or why you shouldn't do something.
Well, and to take the sports analogy into real life, it's so easy to watch the game from the 300 level. It looks so easy. Why didn't you do this? Put somebody down in that environment. Have them step into the batter's box or between the pipes in goal, whatever it happens to be. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of stimulus that you don't see from that 300 level where it looks so easy. And even to bring it to the youth sports level, I'm sure you would be on the same page as me. It's something I don't do anymore, but I'm sure I was guilty of early in my fatherhood and my child's earlier years. You go to a game and you want your child to succeed in that moment. So you yell out an instruction at them from the sideline. Shoot, pass, look over there, do this. It's not helpful. It doesn't allow them to make their own decisions and to learn properly. And if we continue to insulate our kids that way, they're not going to learn those lessons and the resilience that we need them to learn through sport, are they?
No, yeah, and I think it's easier said than done. As much as I talk about this, I still have the thoughts. I still have the moments where I have to catch myself, or maybe go back and say, you know what, son, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But just know you're not alone. If you're a parent listening to this and you're like, I'm still doing this, or I'm just realizing now that I'm doing this, you're not alone. I think all of our intentions, like you said before, are really good. And the information we're trying to present in that moment might be spot on, right? It might be what we see and what the kid needs to do in that moment. But yes, I think differentiating the coach from the parent and the anxiety and the confusion that it can bring to kids and just the reliance on a feedback loop from mom or dad in the stands to have to tell me what to do, um, without really putting in perspective, right? If there's a 20 or 40 or 100 people sitting there in the stands and you're calling your kid out in front of everybody, like, does anybody in the world like that feeling? I don't think so, right? There's a coach who's supposed to be doing that. And I'm sure parents are like, well, the coach is not doing it, so I got to do it. And it's like, take a breath. When is the time where this is most appropriate? Who should be the one delivering that message? And then how that message is being delivered is so much more important than just the words or the actual skill or thing you're trying to address.
Absolutely. Travis, this conversation has been fantastic. I am certainly going to link to the website in the show notes, but give parents an idea of the type of resources available to them at 3athletics.com.
Yeah, so we have a number of books. Our Parent Guidebook Hero, a little deeper self-reflection journey of how to, understand what you're bringing into this, how it impacts your current experience, and how you can start to build that connection and trust with your kid through some intentional conversations. You mentioned the 10 principles. That's just an outline of what we feel like are the 10 kind of most important things for parents to think about, right, as they're entering or they're already in the youth sports space. Recently came out with a car ride home, same concept, 10 principles there, just what we should be thinking about, how we should be preparing ourselves, and kind of some guidelines of what to do and what not to do. And then, we have Coaching Revolution, same concept as a parent guidebook. And then we have our athletes journal I mentioned before. All great resources. We're also in the process of building out a more extensive content library. We have parent workshops up on our website right now that we're going to be transitioning over to a different platform. Also building out stuff for coaches and leadership as well. So really trying to take the concept of books and expand on that and just give parents a library of resources to go in and get different levels of the experience when it comes to content consumption, right? Because not everybody wants to listen to us talk for 80 minutes, even though we feel like, man, you could gain a lot of value out of this. So one of our challenges, right, is trying to find ways to simplify the delivery, enhance the user experience. So just keep following along at www.3athletics.com. I know you said you'd link it, but that's where we're going to be updating things here over the next couple months to let parents know where they can go to get more information and what partnerships look like with some of these organizations as well.
Travis, thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your commitment to helping create better sports parents, which ultimately will result in better sports experiences for children. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you found some tangible tips and takeaways that you can bring with you in your journey to becoming a better sports parent. The best way for you to support this podcast is for you to subscribe, follow, rate, and review on whichever platform you're watching or listening. And the fastest way for us to grow is for you to share this podcast with your respective network and with those other parents and coaches that you see in your youth sports environments. Thanks to Lightstock Music and to Andre Diaconou for the music in this podcast. Until next time, happy sports parenting. And remember, have fun. That's what it's supposed to be about.